Hello and welcome back to World Talks with me, David Kennedy. The Russian private army warlord Yevgeny Prigozhin has made claims about how the criminals he has recruited from prisons to fight in Ukraine have adjusted to life on their return to Russia. To discuss the volatile leader, his unorthodox tactics and how he fits into a possible succession struggle, I'm joined by Jayson Jay Smart, a political analyst joining us from Washington. Jayson, thank you very much for joining us.
Great to see you.
Prigozhin, his claims now, over 30,000 people, he said, have returned to Russia after serving in Ukraine in his Wagner group. They're all actually coming back into society, reformed, not committing any crimes, he says. What do you think about these claims?
Well, I think there's a couple elements to the claims being made by Prigozhin. One is that I think that the number is very high. I doubt it's realistically 32,000. The death rate for Wagner Group is extraordinarily high. And so the reality is it's probably lower. But at the same time, I have very little doubts that people who are locked up in prison, many of which for murder, rape, and other serious crimes, being released into the general Russian society is going to work out very well. And I think it's something that they're going to come to regret in the very near term.
Now, of course, Prigozhin himself, back in Soviet times, knew a little bit about being in prison because he was a gangland leader. He was in prison himself. Maybe this was part of his plan. Maybe that's how he dreamt it up, you know, to be able to form this group of these good guys who were in prison for the wrong reasons or whatever.
Well, I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. He's a career delinquent. I mean, the man is a criminal. And so that was why he was in prison before, and that's probably why he feels a great deal of solidarity with the other prisoners, is they have something in common. They like to break the law. And the invasion of Ukraine would be breaking international law. So it's really just stepping up what they're already used to. The fact is that the prisoners are being used because Russia views it as a net positive. One, people have to die somehow in the war to invade Ukraine, but who's going to die? If we send people from Moscow or St. Petersburg, that will get noticed and they will be missed. Whereas the people in prison are generally sort of abandoned to their fate with little recourse or even legal recourse or financial. And so often to go to Ukraine for 6 months with the possibility of then being released from prison is really a good deal for a lot of them. And sure enough, he was very successful in rounding up a bunches of prisoners and sending them off, usually, to die in Ukraine.
Well, this is it, exactly, to die, because they're not really getting the full training that they should get. They aren't getting the equipment because Prigozhin is practically at war himself with the defense minister Shoigu, so it's not really a great choice. I mean, between being in prison and being out in the front line with little equipment, is it?
Well, there's a lot of evidence that Prigozhin's troops, Wagner troops, have been used, for instance, to locate where Ukrainian artillery is. And how that's done is they simply send the men forward and see who gets attacked and who doesn't. And if they get killed in the process, then it's really not viewed as a loss. They are used in a way that we can consider to be a disposable manner. And that is something that is not an isolated incident. I mean, it's quite common. And that's sort of the brutality of the entire Wagner group. As much as Prigozhin has said publicly in his opposition to Shoigu that he's very strongly trying to support his men and he's only concerned with them, the fact of the matter is he shows no signs of any interest in their well-being or whether or not they will survive. His interest is purely in executing the mission that he has, and the men that he has are considered to be throwaways. I mean, if once they're used, they're gone, and nobody's going to miss them.
In terms of what prison life is like in Russia, it's certainly hasn't really improved much since Soviet times, has it?
I would actually tend to imagine it's gotten worse since the Soviet times. In the Soviet period, at least there was finances to do things, to build prisons. Today, Russia doesn't really do that. It's the leftovers of the Soviet system. And so it's just this general decline over the last 30 years since the breakup of the Soviet Union, as new monies have not been invested, yet the number of prisoners has grown dramatically. And it's gotten worse in the sense that some of the diseases, Russian prisons were always famous for tuberculosis and other communicable diseases. But today, in the case of Wagner Group, there's plenty of evidence that specifically AIDS patients were chosen and others with serious diseases, with sort of the hope probably that they would be killed in Ukraine, which would then lessen the burden on the Russian state to have to take care of them. Not to say that they really took great care of them to begin with when they were in prison, but once they're killed, the cost of taking care of them becomes zero.
That's a rather horrible kind of image, that, of course, of rather than actually caring for prisoners or setting them free earlier if they're in that kind of situation, to send them to their deaths. But returning to the struggle that is going on between Shoigu and Prigozhin, what is at the root of that, would you say?
So that's a really good question. There's a lot of argument being made that the fact is that Putin is allowing for Prigozhin to continue these attacks. If you look at what he says, he never attacks Putin directly, though he attacks those around Putin, for instance, Shoigu. And the reason is it does take the public blame off of Putin and shifts it to Shoigu, which is a typical Putin strategy. And how can he keep himself pure and away from the problems and place it on somebody else? And it looks like that could be part of the strategy. At the same time, there is signs that it's resonating in the population. A review of something like Vkontakte or on the Klasniki, which are Russian social media sites, or Telegram channels, you'll see that there's a huge amount of public interest and support for Prigozhin, much more so than for Shoigu. And so I think that Prigozhin is actually developing quite a bit of political capital, and how he'll use that in the future is a really interesting question.
Now, this traffic, of course, we get an awful lot of traffic here in the West, which is actually developed out of St. Petersburg. How much of that traffic is genuine? Because, of course, it's difficult to say where online traffic in a country like Russia comes from, because a lot of people just would rather be quiet and be safe, wouldn't they?
I think that it's interesting is that there might be a larger understanding of the population. It's hard to prove this, but it looks like there's a larger understanding that the government is probably not telling them the truth about the war. Russians, fortunately, a lot of the Ukrainian news is published in Russian, which means that it does reach Russian readers as well. And they can see that there's an inconsistency between what they see is happening in Ukraine from the Ukrainian news being published in Russian from what the Russian government leaders are saying. And what the Ukrainian news is saying is more similar to what Prigozhin is saying, which means that Prigozhin perhaps is telling the truth. And so that does resonate with people. To say that they're all just sheep and they don't recognize that the government's lying to them is probably not exactly true, because the reality is they see that there's so much counterintuitive information being given out by the Kremlin. Perhaps something else, something deeper is happening. And that's why I think Prigozhin has had the impact he has in society, where he has become a top story for weeks and weeks at this point.
Now, it is a rather strange situation that exists at the moment, that Prigozhin's private army, the Wagner Group, does not actually answer to the Ministry of Defense. I mean, that wouldn't happen elsewhere, would it? That there would be a private army that would be separate in every way in terms of its management, finances, etc., from the Ministry of Defense.
Absolutely the case. I mean, the fact is that at this point there's about, I think, 26 or 27 private military companies inside of Russia. And this is a huge threat to the future security of Russia.
Beg your pardon there. That really surprised me. We only really hear of one, don't we? Is that because his propaganda machine is doing so well?
No, Prigozhin's is by far the largest, the most serious, the most advanced. The others are smaller by comparison. At the same time, though, it's a very big threat for Russia and for Putin that you now have these military companies that have the ability to create violence spread out throughout the country, privately financed, not coordinated with the government, not coordinated with Shoigu. And in the case of Prigozhin, he has to sign any agreement that that the Wagner Group will be underneath the Ministry of Defense. And he has repeated multiple times that he already coordinates with the Ministry of Defense. Signing this agreement is not something that he's willing to do. And though Putin has ordered that done, he has declined to do it. So there's more and more signs that these private military companies have a growing source of power in the country.
And, I mean, could there be a threat to Putin here as well, or at least certainly an uncertain situation in terms of succession?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this does pose a really serious threat for Putin. I mean, there is a hypothesis that one of the reasons Russian authorities have been okay with so many of Prigozhin's Wagner Group getting killed is Shoigu is helping to eliminate what could be a potential threat to himself, which is a Wagner army that would fight against him or fight against the Russian army. And so by allowing them to get killed off in mass, tens of thousands of them at a time, it is actually for the domestic security reasons within Russia, so that these men don't return, these convicted criminals, nor do they have the ability or the desire to wage war against the state in the future.
Well, it's a very odd situation, practically medieval in some ways, but I think you brought a little bit more clarity to us. So meanwhile, Jayson J. Smart, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's all we have time for the moment on World Talks, but we've got the news coming up, so stay watching TVP World.